So this is session 2, but actually it's the end of session 1. I didn't realize I had more slides, so I'm going to conclude the first lecture. So this is a brief reception history. How was Bonhoeffer interpreted from the publication of these prison letters in Unterwegs and the early publication of an abridged, very abridged version of Letters and Papers, of which this is a really old copy. The later edition is much more extensive. The concerns were hermeneutical. They had to do with Bonhoeffer's non-religious interpretation of Christian concepts. And throughout the 60s with the death of God movement and these sorts of things, and then the secular city theologians like Paul Van Buren, William Hamilton, Gabriel Wahanian, and others, Bonhoeffer was used a lot by these thinkers. And as I mentioned earlier, William Hamilton said, we make creative misuse of Bonhoeffer. And they did. And that led to a bit of a reaction where Eberhard Bethge in Germany in particular, but also scholars in America that were studying Bonhoeffer, realized that they needed to get his thinking clarified. And so they did. And so in the period from 65 to 75, it's his life and it's his history, and there is a beginning of literature produced on various elements in Bonhoeffer's theology. And these are the years that are birthing, I think, the best of the Bonhoeffer scholars that have existed. I'm not saying anything negative about Bonhoeffer scholars today, because there are some wonderful, wonderful Bonhoeffer scholars out there. I'm just saying there was a caliber to these men and women in those days that they really raised the bar high for future Bonhoeffer scholarship. And in 1975 to 85, this is the time where I'm getting involved. A lot of work on Bonhoeffer's theological thinking. And then in the mid to late 80s, there was a very pronounced shift in Bonhoeffer studies toward the philosophical, the political, and the ethical. And it has remained there pretty much ever since. Although in the last decade, literature on Bonhoeffer has come out that so there's a generational thing. You have Dietrich, then you have those who knew him, right? Then you have those who knew those who knew him, and now you have those who knew those, kind of, right? So the generation that's writing now, they're all dealing with literature. Bonhoeffer is just a person in the past like Karl Barth is to me. I can only ever know Barth through his writing. There was something very important about being able to be part of that second generation. I knew the people that knew Bonhoeffer, because you could ask questions, you could engage. There was a liveliness. Today, I think it's a lot of speculation and attempts to. I'm not happy with a lot of stuff that's published on Bonhoeffer anymore, and so I don't collect it. I'll read reviews. I'll sometimes go to the library and read the book, but I'm not so happy anymore with it. And that's why the last lecture is going to be dealing with that. And I think that concluded. Oh, geez, I'm going to skip that. Now we get to session 2. Yeah, there's the Karl Barth-Bonhoeffer relationship. Again, they have maybe half a dozen meetings, actually less, over the course of their time together when they're alive together. And an series of exchanges of letters in the 30s, in the early 30s to mid 30s, and then again in the early 40s. So what did Dietrich think about religion? How did he understand it, and what did he criticize about religion? We're going to do an in-depth dive into the letters and papers from prison in this particular talk. But understand that we have to understand there are 4 things surrounding Bonhoeffer. Okay? The first is Karl Barth and his view of religion. In the Roman brief, in the Epistle to the Romans, when Barth went to exegete the text where Paul talks about grace and law, Barth takes law and calls it religion. And he contrasts it with revelation. Okay? So Barth's definition of religion, oddly enough, looks very much like liberal Christianity in Germany. Because of course this is what he's dealing with, cultural Christendom, and as he understands, Paul is arguing against this cultural Judaism. So there is that piece that's in Bonhoeffer's thinking. There's also the philosophy of George Hegel. Now Hegel's theory of religion is reasonably complex, but it can be put down to this, and this is important. We know everything by our senses and our thinking, and God is a datum, another data point, along with the camera, the books, Tommy, you, the computer, the light. It's another data point in the system. And so God gets assimilated to human thinking and assimilated to culture. For Hegel, the world spirit, the spirit of progress that moves through history from thesis to its opposite, antithesis to its resolution, and synthesis, which then becomes a new thesis, which then moves forward into antithesis and back and forth. You have this progress, and so religion is this progressive thing. It's seen as something, I suppose, necessary and perhaps even beneficial. Now, the philosophy of religion as a discipline is just emerging as a science at the end of the 19th century, okay? So it's a brand new science when Bonhoeffer's born, and it's just emerging in the 20s. And so what do we have in the 1920s? We have Freud's theory of religion being proposed, okay? Moses and Monotheism would be the book to read there. And you had earlier theories of religion, like that of, in England, that Bonhoeffer probably wasn't familiar with, like Sir George Fraser's The Golden Bough, that looked at ritual and religion. You had, in the early decades of the 20th century, the first phenomenologists of religion, like Marcel and Mauss. They were actually doing field work and looking at ancient religious, or what we would call ancient religious ritual practice as practiced by Aborigines or uncivilized tribal groups, on the theory that what they were doing today they did 5,000 years ago. Okay, so you have these things in the background, but Bonhoeffer's going to also look at religion as something else. He's going to talk about it as inwardness and piety, and he's going to talk about Methodism. He was a severe critic of what the evangelicals would call having a born-again relationship, where I, me, my, Jesus is my boyfriend kind of thinking. Why is that? Because again, for Bonhoeffer, Christ exists as the community. Now this does not mean that Dietrich does not have a very intimate, or we might use the term personal, relationship with Jesus. We'll see in a minute that he does, but he doesn't start there. On April 30th of 1944, from the Tegel military prison cell, Dietrich writes the first of a series of explosive letters to his friend Eberhard Bethge. What might surprise, or perhaps even worry you, would be my theological thoughts and where they are leading. And here's where I really miss you very much. I don't know anyone else with whom I could talk about them and arrive at some clarity. It's important. Bethge was Bonhoeffer's theological conversation partner, going back to Finkenwald. What keeps gnawing at me is the question, what is Christianity? Or, who is Christ actually for us today? The age when we could tell people that with words, whether theological or pious words, is past, as is the age of inwardness and conscience. And that means the age of religion altogether. So here he's given you two pieces of his understanding of religion. The first is that we're dealing here with words. The second is we're dealing with inwardness and conscience. We are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. Even those who honestly describe themselves as religious aren't really practicing that at all. They presumably mean something quite different by religious. So here is the first time Bonhoeffer is beginning to talk about a shift in history. That we're moving from a period of religion, Christian religion which is oriented to doctrine and words, and also to personal experiences, to something else entirely. And those who claim to work with words like the confessing church, doctrine is really important, or piety, being able to sit there and praise God, over one's meal while the Jews are outside cleaning the sidewalks with toothbrushes, that's over. This period of time is over. He continues with the problematic a priori. Our entire 1900 years of Christian preaching and theology are built on the religious a priori in human beings. In other words, we presuppose humans need God. They're religious. They're that Augustinian, we have a God-shaped, we have a hole in our soul only God can fill concept. Christianity has always been a form, and then notice this, perhaps the true form of religion. Now that is a little small critique, I think, of Karl Barth in a way, because in Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, in Volume 1, Barth, paragraph 17, has a section on religion, and he calls Christianity as the truest form of religion. Yet if it becomes obvious one day that this a priori doesn't exist, that it's been historically conditioned and transitory form of human expression, then people really will become radically religionless. And I believe this is already more or less the case. What does that then mean for Christianity? The foundations are being pulled out from under all that Christianity has previously been. This is written from a prison that's being bombed, a church that has collapsed, a country that has collapsed and is collapsing, a faith tradition that has come under intense questioning and scrutiny. And he says, the foundations are being pulled out from all that Christianity has been, and the only people among us we might end up with in terms of religion are the last of the knights, kind of that Knights Templar, zealot motif, or a few intellectually dishonest people. Are these supposed to be the chosen few? Wow. So he's critiquing this remnant thinking that's out there as well. And he moves on. Are we supposed to fall all over this dubious lot of people in our zeal or disappointment or woe and try to peddle our wares to them? In other words, are we supposed to only go to people that are broken and hurting and weak and tell them they need God, they need God, they need God? That whole thing. Or should we jump on a few unfortunates in their hour of weakness and commit, so to speak, religious rape?
Yikes.
Evangelicalism. If we are unwilling to do any of that, and if we eventually must judge even the Western form of Christianity to be only a preliminary stage of a complete absence of religion, what kind of situation emerges for us, for the church? At this point, I simply also want to note, as he says this, the Western form of Christianity is a preliminary stage to a complete absence of religion. It's very similar to Girard's argument that Christianity is the only religion that predicts its own demise. Okay? Very, very similar. How can Christ become Lord of the religionless as well? If Christ is Lord of the world and not just of the church, how is he the Lord of the religionless? And not in a religion, not in a religious sense, but in whatever he means by religionless. Is there such a thing as a religionless Christian? If religion is only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, and this garb has looked very different from age to age, what then is religionless Christianity. Now, in this letter, he will use this phrase, religious Christianity, twice, okay? But from this point on, he's going to change gears, and he's going to use a different phrase. He's going to talk about the non-religious interpretation of Christian concepts. In other words, rather than religionless Christianity, he can't perceive what religionless Christianity looks like. So he'll clarify that by saying, I want to explore the non-religious interpretation of Christian concepts like God, Satan, miracles, etc., etc. And he continues. Barth, who's the only one to have begun thinking along these lines, nevertheless did not pursue these thoughts all the way. Did not think them through, but ended up, and here's the very famous, with a positivism of revelation. What Dietrich is saying is this: Barth changed. Now, Barth scholars recognize that there's a difference between the Barth from 1917 to 1931, and then Barth writes a little book on Anselm, and Anselm's proslogion, and becomes convinced that he's been doing theology from the wrong place, the wrong starting point, and he's been trying to reason his way to faith, and so Barth now says, no, I trust my way to reason. Faith seeks understanding rather than understanding seeks faith. And at this point, as Barth now shifts gears, he writes his first volume of the Dogmatics in 1932. Okay, there's two parts to the first book of the Dogmatics, published in 32 and 36. Then again in 40, the second volume will come out on the Doctrine of God, and that's two parts, and it's in the prison cell that Dietrich will have the galley prints of the second volume on Barth's Doctrine of Election and that kind of stuff. But here in the early volume 1.1, Barth has the Doctrine of the Trinity and the Virgin Birth, and he discusses these. And this is going to be bothersome because Bonhoeffer feels that Barth is starting with this, in order to do theology, there's this deposit of material, this deposit of revelation, this doctrinal structure that one gets in and then one walks forward from. And Dietrich had real problems with that. And he calls this a positivism of revelation. Barth would later write he didn't understand what that meant at all. He didn't feel like that was fair to him. But still, it's an important question. Does Barth have a positivism of revelation? And there are scholars that say yes, and there are scholars that say no. But Dietrich introduced this distinction.
Do you read that to mean the positivism is an attempt to prove the revelation to be true? Is that what Dietrich
No,
is
because
saying?
Barth eschews apologetics. The positivism is that Barth has Barth has left no room for the intellect prior to faith. Faith, in that Kierkegaardian sense, is the starting point. Okay. Now, I'll continue later because I think Bonhoeffer misunderstood Barth. I really do at this point. I'm fairly convinced of that this is a misunderstanding on Dietrich's part. But it's a real important misunderstanding. For the working person, or any person who's without religion, nothing decisive has been gained here. I mean, I could say, hey, dude, you need to learn all this doctrine, and you're just going to look at me like, what for? The questions to be answered would be, what does a church, a congregation, a sermon, a liturgy, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? In other words, we still presuppose these things will be there. But what do they look like? How do we talk about God without religion? That is, without the temporally conditioned presuppositions of metaphysics, the inner life, and so on. How do we speak in a worldly way about God? This is the piece that the Death of God theologians picked up on in a big way, and they would really twist this. But in this right here, how do we talk about God without religion, without the temporally conditioned presuppositions of metaphysics? I think is finally being answered in these last decades, right, that we're in right now. That question is being answered now, because we've learned to move beyond metaphysics, but we have also reckoned with the fact that we cannot stand on shifting sand. And so there are these wonderful theological alternatives now that are opening up that in the 30s will, I think, prove to be the salvation of the church in America. He continues, how do we go about being religionless, worldly Christians? How can we be ecclesia, those who are called out, without understanding ourselves religiously as privileged, but instead seeing ourselves as belonging wholly to the world? Now this is the theme of the letters and papers from prison. You see, the church is called out, and Christ is the Lord of the church. But Bonhoeffer has been reckoning all his theological life with the fact that Christ is Lord not just of the community, but of the world. And there's an essay in the Ethics that really explores this on Christ and the world. Christ would no longer be the object of religion, but something else entirely, truly Lord of the world. What does that mean? In a religionless situation, what do ritual and prayer mean? Is this where, and this is important, the arcane discipline. Now, what is the arcane discipline? Well, if you were here last time when I spoke, we went over the arcane discipline is the catechetical tradition in the early church that was unanimous across the early church for the first several centuries, that had to do with love the neighbor, love the Lord your God, pray for your enemies, do not resist evil, all of that ethical pattern. And then once you had practiced that for a year or 2 or 3, depending on which environment you're in, only after you had practiced that could you make a commitment to practice it for the rest of your life and then be baptized. Then you were given, for the first time ever, entrance into the Lord's Supper, and you were given the Lord's Prayer. That's the arcane discipline, okay? So it starts out with practice leads to commitment, leads to baptism, leads to life. And of course, this has all been reversed in Christianity, which is where we get them in, save them, and then if we're lucky, we might get a couple of them to follow Jesus. It's totally backwards, right? So he wants to know, is this where this piece comes in? In other words, we should be practicing our Christianity in front of the world, to use an analogy like the Pharisees on the street corners, right? We should be practicing this Christian faith in private together. Not mass meetings, not television shows, not stadiums, private. Small groups. You with me on this? This is where Dietrich's thinking. He says, I'm reluctant to name the name of God to religious people because somehow it doesn't ring true for me there. And I feel a bit dishonest saying it. It's especially bad when other people start talking in religious language. Then I clam up almost immediately and feel somehow uncomfortable and in a sweat. So you aren't the only ones, right? Yet on some occasions, with non-religious people, I can speak God's name quite calmly as a matter of course. Religious people speak of God at a point where human knowledge is at an end. Oh, it's a mystery. That's God. Why did this happen? It's a mystery. And so we bring God in at the outside boundary of our thinking. Religious people speak of God at a point where human knowledge is at an end, or sometimes they're too lazy to think further. And I just love this brutal honesty because this is a major issue, not just in his time, but in ours too. Getting Christians to think is the most difficult task for me in my 40-something years of doing this. Martin Luther King Jr. said, nothing pains some people more than having to think. Okay. So he says, actually, it's a deus ex machina, the God out of the basket, the Superman God, the rescuing God, that they're always bringing on the scene, either to appear to solve insoluble problems or provide strength when human powers fail. thus always exploiting human weakness or human limitations. That lasts only until human beings become powerful enough to push the boundaries a bit further, and God is no longer needed, and this is where we are definitely at today with the technological progress we've made in the 100 years since Bonhoeffer was doing his theological education. We're definitely there right now, okay? So, Dietrich shifts to the question of religious or non-religious interpretation, but he does it in the context as though God does not exist. That's Latin, etsi Deus non daretur. And I find it interesting in the letters and papers from prison where he says, we have to learn to live in the world without God, but with God, as though God does not exist. And he puts this last section in Latin, almost like it's a magical formula, as though God does not exist. Almost as it's like, I'm not going to say this in German. I'll say it in Latin, right? Okay. Oh my. Well, that one went rather rapidly. So, I'm thinking ahead. So in this process of asking about religion, all Dietrich is trying to do is figure out how it is that as a theologian, as a theological thinker, as a pastor, as someone that's having to now help prisoners who grow up Lutheran or Catholic, right? And when the bombs start dropping, guess what you hear in the prison cells? There are no atheists in foxholes, right? You hear men weeping. You hear them praying, you know. And Dietrich feels at this point that, you know, if he was to go in and talk about God, you know, he's just bringing in a Deus ex machina. So how does he? He just simply endures the bombings, and when they come out, you know, he's strong, and they can see him as strong, and hopefully he's modeling something for them, but it's going to be a significant challenge because religion captures the mind, and as long as a person is locked into that world with a Superman God, one's expectations are always moving in that direction. And when that God fails, then faith leaves. Most people lose their faith when God fails their expectations. Okay? All right? It's only because they have been taught an idol that doesn't exist, and idols can't meet expectations. They're powerless. And so Bonhoeffer is asking, how do we talk about Jesus, who's the true Lord of the world, without resorting to religious language? And this still is a challenge today. I know for you, Mike, it's a challenge in preaching. For me, it's a challenge in preaching and teaching. For the rest of you, as you're relating to the world around you, how do you talk about Jesus, the love of the Father manifested in Jesus, without being religious, right? And again, as when we read the section where Dietrich admitted to discomfort talking to religious people, you were all, you know, because we're all there. We all have those Thanksgiving dinners with family members and friends and others, you know, and Facebook. Good heavens. So we're stuck in this same dilemma today in America, which makes the work that Dietrich is doing in his time so important for us, and why and where we can begin to really process in the church today so that we can indeed come out the other side. He didn't have that opportunity, but we do.